So thanks for joining again to one of our monthly OpenAir expert webinar series. This topic today is about release management, and since there was a release in April, we thought it would be pretty timely to have this webinar. We haven't done this one in about 5 years, actually. It was one of the first webinars we ever did. So a lot of the concepts still apply, and there's been some changes in how the OpenAir system releases happen, so it's, again, timely for us to kind of visit this topic. Okay, so what we're going to cover is just talking a little bit about what is release management, how we view release management, traditional release management versus SAS. Since we've done this webinar 5 years ago, the world of SAS has changed quite a bit. There's tons and tons of systems out there that are subscription-based. So it's a more common understanding of what a SAS system is all about, but we'll still kind of cover traditional versus SAS as far as release management content. And give you some suggestions that we have, that we follow when we work with customers, what we call 5 easy steps to be effective in your release management and coordination of those changes in your production environment. So let's go ahead and get started with the first topic, which is what is release management. So, sort of the official definition according to TopStep is basically it's actually a process and understanding what is being changed in the product by the vendor, and then you as the consumer have responsibility to ensure that whatever the changes are compatible with how you're using the system. Of course, the vendor is responsible for the base core product, making sure everything holds together, making sure there's no negative impact to the baseline, the software baseline that the vendor owns. But of course, anything that you may have done special to the system or processes that you have in place, they may actually be impacted by the vendor changes. So there is a bit of a process related to release management. It's just not about feature releases. And you'll also want to make sure that you determine how your end users are impacted, if there's any training needs. So release management is sort of beyond just feature functionality rollouts. It's understanding process impacts, training impacts, and applicability of any of the new features to your environment. Okay? And the vendor itself can't necessarily give you all that information, so there is sort of a sharing of responsibility when it comes to release management. The vendor, of course, producing those changes in the system, and you as the consumer understanding how to handle those changes, when to handle those changes, and how to approach that change management. What we see is, being a SaaS model, the OpenAir system being a SaaS model, you don't actually have to install anything. Of course, there's, you can argue that there's the small things like the Outlook connector and the Microsoft Project connector and Integration Manager, and yeah, you have to download those things. But the core product, the online product that you're logging into to do your project management, your timesheet entry and expenses, you don't see any of that code. You don't download anything related to that code. It's all owned by NetSuite. And so when they release stuff, it's their responsibility to make sure that code baseline is still keeping whole, that nothing breaks. So you may not actually notice that there's been changes in the system. Now, some of the releases, especially the April release, for example, had a lot of little cosmetic changes. So those may have jumped out at you if you're a frequent user of the system. The rounding of the buttons and the location of the error messages or the confirmation messages on the pages. Those kind of things you may have picked up that those changed a little bit in April. But for the most part, brand new features just don't pop into the system. You have to enable them. So the SAS tool release management is a little different in the fact that a responsible SaaS vendor will make sure that when they roll out a new release, nothing actually breaks. And you can continue to use the system as you always have, year after year after year after year, not turning anything new on, not changing any of your processes, because it's one of those if it ain't broke, don't fix it type mentalities. So with that, the release management sometimes it gets overlooked because, well, nothing's really broken, so we'll just continue to work at it, even though you may be doing something like, okay, I have to run this time entry report and I have to filter it all these different ways in order to get these 3 different downloads that I want, when in fact in 2010, the time entry tab came out and all you had to do was enable that, and now you have sort of a quick column filter view versus having to write all of these reports. So those little things, again, not broke, don't fix it, but there's efficiencies that can be gained because as features come out, the features are based on the demand of the customer base, right? So if you need something to run quicker or access faster or report on easier, that's the whole intent of the release management by the vendor. So those features that you a long time have wanted may have shown up over the years, and if without taking advantage of those releases, you may still be doing the same thing you're doing every day without finding any efficiencies in using the system. And of course, that's something where Top Step gets called quite often to help out with. Okay, it's the SAS tool itself. Not that you would necessarily and purposely overlook the release management, but since you don't have to physically install anything, and you may get 1 or 2 emails that says, "Hey, a release is coming," "Hey, a release just happened," but your day-to-day life isn't changed. It's easy to sort of forget about. It's not your traditional software where you have to, if you have QuickBooks, you have to download the upgrade and you have to upgrade your system. And that's a purposeful step that you have to do in order to do release management with those kind of traditional products. So if you compare them side by side, I always look at traditional as there's really kind of 2 types of traditional release management. You got your product updates, those service packs for Windows, if those of you are on Windows, or full product upgrades like the QuickBooks example I just gave. The new features are typically only available in those upgrades, so you can't just sort of, I need to download a new way to do invoice layouts in QuickBooks. Then you can't really download a single feature. You'd have to download or upgrade the whole product. Any of those patches or those service packs that tend to get released for products that you're downloading or installing, like Firefox version 15.132 or something, they shouldn't really impact day-to-day usage. They're meant to more fix things, things that were reported as bugs. They tend to be things that lock down security holes, increase performance, correct issues that have been reported to the vendor. And of course, the release of those service packs, the release of an upgrade of a version is all controlled by the vendor, and then it's communicated to the consumer to say, hey, you have to take action in order to use this new functionality, in order to use this new patch. For those of you, when I've used a Windows machine, so I have that auto install of service packs in there. So there is some automation to it, but it's still something that has to run behind the scenes that I could turn off if I wanted to and no longer get those updates. Versus the SAS model, with the SAS model, there's basically one code baseline, and it's owned by the vendor. Anything that's a new feature is released as part of that single baseline, and the vendor will perhaps give you controls as to how to configure and manage the changes that are coming in that baseline. So they don't necessarily say, okay, well, you have to do invoicing this way in OpenAir now. They give you an option to say, hey, here's a different way you can do invoicing. Here's the feature, here's how it works. So they've done their testing for compatibility of all of their standard functionality in the system as part of their core QA system, or at least they should. And then it's really up to the end user, the consumer, to decide if the feature functionality needs to actually be changed in their own system, and then they will control the timing. So at the end, in both models, the consumer or the customer is the one that sort of decides the when, but as far as the availability to do the install, the SAS, it's sort of already there, ready to get picked up whenever the customer decides. In traditional, there's still sort of an install download step that has to happen before you can sort of finalize things. The management cycles are sort of similar. They just have sort of one key difference, right, is when you want to do a release management cycle, you want to sort of start in some kind of test environment where you can check things out. And that's the same on both sides, traditional and SAS. You don't want to kind of throw stuff into production and test it there. There are a couple of exceptions in the world of the OpenAir system, as you may know, regarding checking out emails and stuff like that. But in both cases, you start off with a test environment. But the next step is different between the two. The next step in the traditional environment, you're actually having to do your upgrade or your install step, whereas SAS you may have to literally just check a box or submit a ticket to NetSuite OpenAir support and say, hey, can you turn on this switch? So it's more of an activation versus an install step, and that's where the big difference is. But then from that point, you continue with the rest of the cycle, actually almost lockstep between the two environments. Doing a test plan, planning when you're going to put that in production, and then communicating those changes, and then just continuing the same thing. So in the traditional versus SaaS model, your test environment may be something that is, it may get stale after a while, but the SaaS model will always have the correct baseline underneath it so you can activate new features at any time, versus a traditional environment where the traditional environment could actually just completely age, and you may have to do a lot of work to get it up to a certain product level or install level before you can do any kind of testing. So there's sort of a different approach because of the test environment and the nature of the software. But what are the costs between the two? And I think this is where the difference is, traditional environments, you really do need a full test environment. So if you do have like QuickBooks or Oracle or something, you have to basically create a test version of those. So you may have to invest in more servers to be able to install that software. You have to keep some kind of data synchronization in place. You may have to purchase additional licenses of the product to be able to have that environment. Make sure you have a lot of good test scenarios defined. Your coordinating effort with maybe the IT group to do your production cutover. And you do have to deal potentially with the loss of productive and billable hours of people because you have to sort of shut down production in order to do your production cutover activity. Now on the SaaS side is more email communication. You don't really have to build a full test environment. It's really something that can be there automatically. Like those of you who own a sandbox, you can just get a refresh of your production account, and now your SaaS system is ready to go. There's no installs, there's no additional servers. It's all part of your licensed product if you have the sandbox option in your contract. So really you're doing more email communication saying, hey, we're going to turn these features on in Sandbox and try them out. Definitely defining some test cases. And then before you put it into production, you do some production cutover. But ideally, you should have minimal to no loss of end-user productivity because it's really, after you've done your testing in the SaaS environment, ideally it's really just a couple of checkboxes and an email that says, hey, this is now enabled in the system. Of course, there are exceptions. Many of you could argue like, well, if I turned on the booking planner, I want to make sure I fix all of my bookings. Well, that's a whole data migration activity. Yes, that could potentially impact your production cutover, but that's so that you're cleaning up data that ideally is already looking good in the system, and so you have to do a cleanup before the feature could be effectively used. So there probably is some data impact type things, but ideally there's no real loss of time because it's just a checkbox configuration. Log out, log in, it's available. So the bottom line is really from a release management and the cost investment to do sort of feature checkout, it should actually be less time and effort in a SaaS environment, but you still should do it. I think that's what we run into with customers that deal with not just with the OpenAir product, but any online product, is that, well, I'll just turn it on and start using it in production, when in fact there really actually should be a little bit of a testing window to make sure it complies with your expectations, your business process, and it provides the benefit as to why you want to use the feature to begin with. So I think it's still important. It just doesn't require as much setup as you would normally do in a traditional software install environment. So what if you don't do release management? What if you're like, yeah, I've been using the system for 5-6 years. I've turned a couple things on, but I really haven't done a lot of stuff with it. What's the big deal? Well, obviously your system configuration will start getting stagnant. Is that a problem? Not really, but it could be a scalability impact. So there are a lot of features over the years. I've been working with the system for 10 years, and I see that there's been a lot of features that have really addressed sort of scalability and being able to work in larger companies. So companies who are very diverse across different countries, maybe their user base has grown from 100 to 5,000. So all of those, if you reflect on how you're using the system, if your company went from 100 people to 5,000 people, would you do things differently? Would you try to automate more? Would you try to use reporting and dashboards more versus downloading data and sort of using spreadsheets? Like, what would you do differently? And there's been a lot of feature functionality added to the tool to sort of address sort of that scalable challenge that customers that are in a growth pattern face. And so if you don't take advantage of the features that are coming in the release, you may have missed out on that, and now the tool just seems to be more of a hindrance than a help, and that's the whole reason that you have the tool, is to help you. What about pulling the data from the system? A lot of feature changes in the reporting. So when custom calculations came out, and then the ability to filter on certain types of data in the custom calculations, and then to put date ranges on it, that opened a whole world to replace a one-click report run versus downloading 7 tables worth of data and doing everything in a spreadsheet with some macros and stuff. So more easy real-time data extraction versus having to manipulate that coming out of the system. Anything that could reduce duplicate effort, reduce spreadsheets, ease data maintenance issues. I mean, bookings alone, that's something that many of our customers work with day in and day out. And it's your scheduling, it's your resource availability, it's your sort of staffing analysis, and keeping that data up to date is never easy, no matter how many features come out. But some of the features that have come out in the past 5-6 years really have helped create more bulk edit, more quick update type functionality, as well as visibility. So that data maintenance becomes easier if you're taking advantage of the newer features. Okay. So does it break your system to not upgrade? No. But you will continue to run into challenges as you grow as a company, and so these features that come out are really something that's worthwhile to look into. So what are some of the cost savings if you keep up with the releases? I mean, obviously you could gain efficiencies from a business perspective by removing workarounds and just automating a lot of processes that you may have been doing manually, downloading data manually to put into spreadsheets when you could do a one-click run or even a portlet report view on the dashboard. Okay. Get rid of the sort of manual data entry if you could automate and do integrations based on enhancements with how you can access certain tables. Reducing system administration is always something that you should be on the lookout for, because if you have a full-time person that managing your OpenAir system and that's all they do, you're probably a very large company. And when I say very large, like 5,000, 10,000 people. If you have one person dedicated and you only have 100 people in the organization, is that person really just doing system administration, or is there something else that they're doing that's sort of doing the work where the consultant should be doing the work? So looking at feature functionality that you can use to empower your user base to access the system more and take some of the burden off of those ops admin people that could be working on other things to help grow the business. And of course, as it comes to integrations, anything we can do to streamline that interface, or maybe even remove interfaces if you don't need it because you can get the data out of a single source system. So every time you look at a release and look for ways to sort of minimize administration, minimize end user time, get quicker information, more accurate information, that's always something I think is a soft cost improvement, as well as potentially a hard cost if you can reduce systems that you're combining into one. You're using more features in OpenAir, so you can get rid of a tool like your expense system or something. You could use the features in OpenAir if they suddenly started to meet your requirements for expenses. So that's all well and good, Jody, but how would you recommend handling release management? So I've been talking about testing and evaluating the features, but really it starts off with who owns OpenAir and what do they own in OpenAir. So a lot of times an OpenAir administrator is actually from the business. They don't necessarily belong in IT unless there's a lot of integrations, or there's an IT contact in OpenAir, but there tends to be an OpenAir administrator that's part of the business because a lot of things that have to do with OpenAir administration are directly related to business processes. Should somebody have permissions to see cost? Should somebody be able to run a report and get profitability? Who is responsible for maintaining the leave accrual rules for vacation balances? None of those things necessarily are strictly IT. Those are more business process, policy, data viewing type controls that the business can make decisions on. And since OpenAir is a checkbox configuration type tool, a business owner can actually be in those roles. So the person that really should be looking at the release management features tends to be somebody from the business, because they're looking at it for impacts on business processes, how well data maintenance is being complied with, or how accurate is the data maintenance, is familiar with some of the end user requests. So if you do have sort of a central help desk in IT, maybe the person in IT knows this information, but at least there's been some kind of communication back to the vendor about enhancements that they want, reporting that they want in the system. So those are all sort of business impact items, and whoever is the business owner of OpenAir would sort of be able to look at a release in light of the business model that they're supporting with the tool. Now, an IT owner should be part of the release management if you have things like interfaces, because that's definitely an IT thing, or your IT group is a part of that, whether it's batch or API. If there's multiple systems maybe that have to be synchronized, such as like an HR system, and along with OpenAir, and making sure that there's an understanding of how data is viewed in each system, and if there's any kind of integrations, of course, between the systems. And if IT happens to be your help desk and your administrator of OpenAir. It really depends on your organization structure and who is the owner of the OpenAir system within your company. But identify who those people are, because those are the people that should know enough not only to evaluate a feature from its functionality, advertised functionality, but to get a good understanding of, would this benefit the business? Because you do have the bigger picture of what's going on from a business process perspective and a data accuracy, data maintenance perspective in the system. The second is identify the features that you feel should be tested against your business model. So the releases that are coming out now for OpenAir, they're quite large. There's lots of functionality within them. How do you figure out which ones to test? We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But if there's a feature that says, oh, the buttons are now round versus square, you probably don't have to test that. That's just a UI, nice little visual thing in the system. But if there's something like the booking bulk editor that you think, hey, this would probably help us maintain the data in the system, and it's a whole new feature, that probably should have some kind of test plan with it. Like, how are you going to test it? How are you going to make sure people know how to use it? So going through the feature, and like I said, the features are the releases. The releases are quite large now, and determining which features you want to take a look at, that's the hardest part, I think, of the release. Not so much doing the testing, it's identifying what you really care about in the release and what would be a benefit to you. So looking at the release notes that OpenAir produces, take a look and see what, if you're doing bookings for your resource scheduling or allocations for your resource scheduling, look at the features that are coming out in that module area, and would they help your team manage the data better, or view the data better, or enter the data better. And if it looks like there's a potential, then that's the kind of features that you can test. And how should you test it? How do you do stuff every day? Do a normal day in the life type test scenario. How easy is it to fix things? How easy is it to enter things? You also want to compare the release notes to any sort of enhancements that you've submitted to the OpenAir organization. So you may have asked for something, and now it's coming in the release, and it could be a one-liner highlight that says, and now the reporting can do this. But that's what you submitted a few months earlier or a couple of years earlier, and now it's here. So definitely test those, because you'll want to make sure it's sort of hitting the mark of what you expected it to work like. And anything that looks like it would be a value add as far as reporting is concerned. I think reporting is one of the bigger areas. If there's feature changes in reporting, you'll definitely want to kind of take a look at that. If you have some kind of administrator guide, I'd take a look at the administrator guide and compare it to the release notes to see if there's any functionality that you're using that you may just not think about anymore because it's just sort of everyday type maintenance. User entity tags, for example. Any enhancements there, you may want to test those out. So really the key is taking a look at what the release contains, comparing it to your business model, and then identifying what things could potentially be a benefit for you to use. Something to avoid, there's usually some features that are like, wow, this feature sounds really cool. For example, when revenue containers came out, revenue container feature, very nice feature, but not too many customers actually need to approve revenue in the system. It's more of a run the rules and create the transactions. So you can evaluate that feature, but just because it's cool does not necessarily mean it's a good fit for your business model. So keep that in mind as you're looking at some of the newer features that are sort of, definitely introducing more structure. Does your company need that structure? Is it the right time to sort of introduce that kind of thing in the environment? The third step is test. So you actually should test. I mean, obviously the vendor's testing in their environment, but with all of the configuration potential differences between different companies and different installs, the QA process in the NetSuite OpenAir system is robust, but have you ever been impacted by a release? Probably. And it's because there's just almost no way that you can test every single possible combination of what customers have in their environment before the release goes out. So I definitely encourage people to do some test cases, day in the life, normal processing, timesheet entry, expense entry, project creation, invoicing, reporting, dashboard checkout, and just have those set of test scenarios handy to kind of continue to use them over and over again every time there's a release. Ideally, you can do the testing in a sandbox environment. I realize not every customer has a sandbox environment because it is an additional fee. So you can do some of this testing in production, but you are sort of in a situation that testing in production, you may be exposing things to people, like new functionality to people that's not quite ready to be adopted in your system, and people will look at the system like it's not stable. Suddenly something shows up today that wasn't there yesterday, and it may raise eyebrows or people ask questions about it, when in fact you're just evaluating a new feature. So communication is in one of the steps here that we'll talk about in just a second. After you've done your testing and you feel that features are good to be rolled out to the organization, I definitely suggest coordinating a production cutover plan. It could be a very simple, hey, by the way, on Saturday morning, I'm going to implement this new field on your timesheets, and an email goes out to everyone across the company, and you put something on the message board inside OpenAir. And that could be it from a production cutover perspective. It's just make sure I turn this on at 10 o'clock on Saturday. Or it could be something more robust, like, hey, we're going to go ahead and roll out resource management processes because now there's functionality in the system that we really like, and we want to do resource management in OpenAir. So we're going to roll out a whole process, a whole ownership. We're going to do initial data population. That requires a little bit more coordination because somebody has to actually do the work in the production environment. There might be some training that has to be coordinated, and then there's the whole go live. So obviously there's scales of production cutover activities, but still make it a point to sort of coordinate, yes, this is when this will go into production. I think sometimes with it being such a configuration, like a checkbox configuration system, it's very easy to say, oh, one day I'm just going to go ahead and check this, turn this on, then tomorrow you turn something else on, and then the next day a new custom field shows up, and then the next day a custom calculation shows up, and 3 new reports show up, and every day there's something changing in the environment. And your end users might be getting confused, like, okay, the system really is not stable because it keeps changing. If you focus more on like sort of releasing your releases, like pulling all of the things that you want to change for the system together and sort of launching those at one time, people will then get used to knowing that when there's change happening, there must have been some communication somewhere. There must have been there's a message board, or there's an intranet site or something that explains what just got deployed, and have it feel more like a release management versus just feature activation ad hoc type stuff. So So definitely think in terms of OpenAir releases entire groups of features. You guys can do the same thing internally and just sort of plan out when that's going to happen in your production environment. And finally, communicate. So people may not notice change if they don't use the system very often, but for those of you in your systems that are using it day in, day out, if somebody adds a new field or somebody changes something in the system, you notice it right away. And what's your first response? What the heck? Who changed this? Right? So you really want to make sure there's at least communication out to the organization. Hey, this is coming. Hey, this is installed. Hey, this was just installed. Hey, what do you think about this feature that was installed last week? You know, just sort of continuing to communicate to the organization that you have implemented a new feature, new functionality, and why, what was the driver, and sort of group that into sort of production releases yourself internally. The communication, like I said, could be emails, it could be an intranet site, it could be a message board, but definitely implement sort of a change control approach so that people understand that something will be changing or something has changed and why that occurred. So timing considerations, when should you do any of this? So, you know, NetSuite, the releases have come down. They used to be 6 a year. They were small releases, so there was always something new on the horizon. Now it's reduced down to 2 a year, I believe, and we're seeing April and October typically. The April release just happened, and in this latest release, NetSuite took a slightly different approach than they have in the past, and I think this is an approach that they're going to continue going forward. The release information is available in a sandbox environment 2 weeks prior to production. That's been in place for about 1.5 years, 2 years now, and it's nice because it gives you an opportunity to try to see early on, before everything hits production, what's coming in the release, because those release features are in the sandbox environment. Unfortunately, what that meant is for customers who did not own a sandbox environment, they still had to wait until production. So this last release in April, which is something I hope they continue going forward, all customers were actually given a preview environment. So it was a copy of their production environment. It was preview.openair.com, and it also was available 2 weeks before production. So you logged into it the same way you did production, you just used a different URL. You could ask for features to be activated from the release, so you could take a look at it in conjunction with your current production environment. So it was really a nice way to sort of very quickly check out features without having to wait for it to hit your production environment. That preview environment did come with some limitations, like you couldn't use it for any kind of integration testing, which I can understand. And similar to a sandbox, it doesn't support email testing. So any new features that come out with sort of like the conditional notification feature in April came out with lots of conditions being added. But you couldn't really test any of that because you can't get emails out of sandbox or preview environments. So you had to wait until that went into production before you could do any kind of testing. So unfortunately, those two environments do have some limitations, but for the most part, you can do a lot of testing in those environments of the features before that hits the production account. So we've got a 2-week window before it hits production. So obviously, sort of schedule your activities around those 2 weeks. And then it'll hit production, and you can continue any final testing before you can decide to turn things on in production. The announcement for the releases really start about 4 weeks before the production cutover. So probably the 3rd, 4th week of March, I started getting emails that, hey, a release is coming on April 18th. A preview account will be available 2 weeks before on April 3rd. And so I would be getting emails as the administrator. And the release information is actually on the login screen. It's interesting whenever I go to these OpenAir user groups and we talk about, hey, did you guys know there was a release? And a lot of times I get the comment of, no, how come nobody tells us when there's a release? And what's interesting is that when people have sort of the login page up and they have their IDs information stored on the login page, you tend sort of not to look at the login page anymore. You sort of bring it up as a necessity to click that login button. But actually, next to the login page, there's usually a block here. It's in a gray message block. But that gray message block has some pretty important information like, hey, a release is coming on April 18th. So it's pretty easy to sort of miss if you're not paying attention to what's on this page. And what some of you may not realize also is that, and I've got my zoom actually smaller than a normal page, but if it was at 100%, you probably would not actually see this bottom part which says NetSuite OpenAir Enhancements. Because the next question I get is, well, okay, so that's great. What's coming in the release? And actually the only way that you'll find that out is once the release is available. Okay, so that's actually my next set of slides. And how can you find that out? There's a few places within the environment that you can find what was in the release. And one of them is actually on the home page. But if you don't think to scroll down, you won't see the information. So there's really three areas where the information about the release is advertised, and none of those areas have the information until the release is known to the sandbox accounts. So even top step, we don't get any advanced notice about what features are coming. At SuiteWorld, there was some indication of what's on the roadmap, what could be coming this year, but no guarantee that, oh yes, definitely it will show up in the next release. So you don't really know until the release is available in the Sandbox account. Once it's available in the Sandbox account, the Suite Answers website, which is the support tab, would have information about the release notes. The login screen that I just showed you has information about the release notes. And there's actually a product updates URL that has all of the historical information for the release notes. So all the release notes are available in the Sandbox account the minute it hits Sandbox, and then the day it goes into production, of course, all those locations are available in your production OpenAir. But of course, the bigger question is, okay, great, so now I found out the release is coming. It's the Monday after Sandbox is available. I've got the list of features. Now, which one should I check? I'm looking at it from my business model. I'm looking at it from my admin guide. Still not quite sure what to use. I think of in terms of questions. What questions can you ask yourself? Is this feature related to what I'm already using? If there's a new feature related to bookings and you're not using bookings, then you probably don't need to test the feature. Is it something that you may consider using in the future? Sure, but you could make that decision at any point in time. It's not necessarily related to this particular release because you only have 2 weeks before it hits production. So focus on the stuff that's going to impact right away that you would want to plan for. Is this feature auto-enabled? Okay. If it is auto-enabled, which means you don't have control about turning it on or off, definitely jump into your Sandbox or your preview environment and take a look at it right away. Make sure it's nothing that you have a problem with or it impacts your reports or your business processes. 99% of the time, auto-enable is really just more UI, visual changes in the system. But if it's auto-enabled, you can't turn it off. There might be some switches that you can submit to NetSuite to say, hey, can you disable this? But usually it's something that's more cosmetic, and I would test those in the Sandbox right away. This last release, there were a lot of things auto-enabled, but there were things like the message was in the middle of the screen instead of at the top of the form. The buttons were rounded. Anyone notice that the delete link, now you can't actually see the word delete unless you hover over it with your cursor and suddenly delete shows up because they tried to make it a little less obvious that delete was an option. So it's just those kind of changes in the environment. And if any of those are causing an issue with your end users or with the usability of the system, you have an opportunity to feed that back to NetSuite. So I would definitely jump in and submit something to the vendor for that. Are any of these features something that could impact any of my existing reports? Typically there isn't an impact to any of the existing reports unless there's a whole change to how reporting is done. So I know there's some work on the reporting interface right now. Would that impact the reports? We'll wait and see. Okay. Could this impact any of my existing integrations? So if there's new feature functionality in how you're maintaining the data, is that information that also needs to be considered as part of the integration work? Are there triggers now that need to be considered as part of some of the information that you're tracking in the OpenAir system? Scripting is a big thing now in the OpenAir environment, and there's continual enhancements to the way scripting is being done. Even in the past year, they've introduced a different way to store the scripts, a different way to trigger the scripts, a different way to run the scripts from when it first came out 2 years ago, so or a year and a half ago. So as those features continue to expand in scripting, you definitely have to take a look and say, do I have to make sure I migrate or change or amend what I have in the system to be able to handle the way that scripting is being enhanced this round? Okay. And finally, is email involved in this feature? I really want to check out the notifications feature with all of the conditional control on when to send out an email, but I had to wait until it was in production. So I put it in my test plan. I wanted to check it out, but I couldn't do anything with it until it actually went into production, and then I was able to do some testing with it in my production environment to control. But I had to make sure it was a controlled test, so I wasn't sending emails to everyone in the company. Okay. So take a look at the release notes, kind of compare it to your business model, and ask yourself these questions, because you really want to make sure that your reports continue to work right, and then look to see if the feature will help with data maintenance. Okay. Some of you on the phone may know that we do this automatically ourselves. We actually do perform testing of the releases when they come out. We want to stay on top as far as the experts. We like to be able to make sure that we pass this information on to our customer base. So we actually do release management ourselves internally. I coordinate when we're going to change things in our environment. But we also write up our recommendations on the release, including identifying when things are auto-enabled, when things are not recommended because our testing has shown that they're not quite there stability-wise. Maybe there's something that requires us to look at like third-party or like JavaScripting type things that we're not necessarily experts on, but we want to work with people who are experts to get their opinions. So we go through and we make sure we understand everything that's coming in the release so that we can pass this information on to the customer base, the customer community. And we do it through something called Release Management Offering, which is something, it's an annual fee, and then we just give you these recommendation reports, which are actually quite robust. We go through and we identify what we have found in our testing as far as limitations, dependencies, and where we think the usefulness would be, as well as what kind of training you would need for your individuals should you roll this out, and what kind of change management consideration. Should you just be sending an email out? Should you be doing formal training? When should you do it? Should you wait until month end to do these kind of changes? Is this something that you could just turn on and communicate through a message board? So we like to, these best practices that we're talking about in this webinar, we actually do this with customers on a regular basis because release management is an important way to keep on top of the investment that you've made in this tool and for it to be productive for you as a tool going forward. So in summary, after the summary, I'm going to open up the lines for questions. So if you have any, be ready. But basically the SAS system, if you have a SAS system like an OpenAir tool, it eliminates a lot of sort of the hard costs that you have as far as servers and having to purchase upgrades and stuff like that of a product. But actually it doesn't really change what you should be doing when you get new feature functionality, when you get new baselines. You just happen to be able to access them more readily because you don't have to do any kind of install step. There's just a configuration step, and we really strongly recommend that you do like a test window. You do sort of a release management internally to do change coordination so that people are understanding how you're continually evolving the tool and it's all controlled within your own environment. And that way you'll definitely get some communication back with your end users. They'll let you know, hey, I wish the system would be able to do this. Kind of keep that open dialogue. You kind of keep a bag of requests ready to address as far as releases come out. If the feature is there, you can say, hey, this request was made by our team. The vendor has implemented it, and now it's in production. So people can see the benefit of providing feedback to you. really the whole goal of release management is, definitely continue to get the most out of the OpenAir tool. You made an investment in it. It can do a lot, but you can probably do more with it if you keep on top of the releases and the features that have come out, especially in the past year and a half. There's been some tremendous feature changes that really have helped, such as drag and drop and inline editing and things like that, they're definitely going down a good path of improvement. Thanks for joining. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or have any actually comments would be great. Feel free to email us. You can email me directly at jcicci@topstepconsulting.com or info@topstepconsulting.com. And of course, we're always watching out for comments and questions on the OpenAir users LinkedIn group, and definitely have our website updated with all the user groups that we expect to continue doing throughout the year and these webinars. So again, thank you very much for your participation, and we'll talk again next month. Take care.